Hi everyone, and welcome to Compnow's webinar on how to proactively protect your school from cyber attacks with Arctic Wolf. My name is Julian Critchlow, CTO at Compnow. I'm delighted to be joined by Steve Hunter, Director of Sales Engineering ANZ at Arctic Wolf. Steve, good to see you again.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Steve, we've known each other for the best part of a decade, but I think it'd be really great to give the participants on the webinar watching today a little bit of background about your history in cyber. I think you've been in this field a very long time. I think it'd be great to share some of the things you've done and the experience and expertise you bring to organizations you support.
Fantastic. Thanks, Julian. So I've been in cyber now for the best part of 2 decades, predominantly in enterprise cybersecurity and enterprise IT. So I started internal IT at BHP, worked at Cisco Systems, internal IT, and then on the customer side. But I did a big stint with a cybersecurity provider, focused on IoT security for 5 years, which is where we met. And that was very much focused at the very large end of enterprise. I was at Google Cloud for a couple of years, and I left Google to join Arctic Wolf when Arctic Wolf came to Australia in October of 2022, mostly because we were bringing all of that enterprise experience into the mid-market of Australia. And interestingly enough, we've landed very strongly in education here in Australia.
Beautiful, that's brilliant to hear. And thanks for that. And look, cyber incidents are becoming very prescient for all of us. I think every single one of us, either personally or professionally, has been impacted by a cyber breach where we've lost data. You know, it's either something at the home where we've felt that impact, or in the workplace where we've seen downtime caused by a cyber breach. And I think schools are no exception to that, right? They're becoming much more of a target for cyber incidents than perhaps they've been in the past. With things like, cybersecurity, risk, the brand and reputational damage that brings, it's not becoming just an high priority action for IT, it's really an high priority action for the entire board too. So given that, let's talk through why is cybersecurity becoming such a critical issue for schools in Australia today? What are you seeing in that side?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. So I think there's a couple of things about working with schools that has surprised me coming out of sort of bigger enterprise. Number one is that the sorts of investment that schools are making in cyber and in technology in general is very high. It's very familiar technology. If I've come from large enterprise into schools, they're running the same kind of tools. But the difference is that the teams are so lean. They tend to be very small. They're doing asked to do a lot with quite a few less folk. And with regards to cyber, I mean, it wouldn't be a week that we would go past without getting a ATO phishing email or a spam from the toll providers on the road or something like that. And it's represented definitely in schools, where they're a very attractive target for threat actors that are out in the world. I was looking just before I came here today at sort of our history for incident response. And it's interesting to note, so Arctic Wolf, we do incident response globally. For the first half of 2024, schools were the fourth most impacted category of industry for our incident response teams. But interestingly, for ransomware and extortion events, they were number 3. Compared to business email compromise, where they were number 10. So that's quite different to what we see with enterprise, where business email compromise is very much further up the list. So I think schools they have such a wide variety of data. They have such a wide variety of sort of protect surfaces that need to be considered. And they're using all of the enterprise class tooling, but with very, very finite resources. So they're very much at risk.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up the differences in the type of threats they face, because schools take the same tooling, as you said, as different enterprises, but are now perhaps orchestrating those limited resources in the wrong areas. Where if the business threat, email is a much more less serious category for them, and they're tooling up things like their phishing awareness training around and that sort of area where it's not really where they should be targeting. So if we expand on that a little bit more, Steve, where do you think those specific threats really are? Folks at the independent schools that they should be aware of, and perhaps the ones that they should be looking to focus more of those resources on?
Yeah, absolutely. Another really good question. I think there's a couple of key areas with regards to sort of the threat actors or the threats that schools are facing, not so much just the threat actors. Certainly there's the external actors, right? And we still see schools being compromised, interestingly, predominantly through things like remotely available external access. So multiple examples in Australia, actually here in Victoria, of schools being breached through things like their VPNs, not implementing some basic controls like multi-factor authentication. But in our incident response research, it's interesting that the insider threat for schools is actually very high compared to enterprise, because we have these, generally it's students, that are playing with cyber tools. We have a really interesting example from a couple of weeks ago. where our security operations center responded to a school alert that had come in because we detected the use of a Flipper Pro, one of those little kind of IoT hacking gadgets, updating from the student network. So it was reached out to a GitHub repo, had pulled down the updates. And it just reinforces to us that the protect surface for schools, yes, there's a huge amount of really important data in the kind of the faculty and the business side. And as an aside, that's actually probably the most interesting thing that I discovered when I started working with the independent schools around Australia, was just the wide variety of the types of data that schools are responsible for handling. It's the combination of kind of the worst of the financial world, the most difficult in terms of healthcare records, things like legally privileged information, apprehended violence orders, all of those things. So, schools literally are a big mixing pot of all of the different sorts of industries when it comes to data protection. Combine that with, faculty that are focused predominantly on teaching, a very lean IT staff, and then the entire student population that are incented to learn about cyber and potentially attack internally.
Yeah, and it's always interesting in schools because the children are, there is accountability, obviously because they're children, but they have access to this data and need to almost behave in a very way similar to a business, but with much more compliance and regulatory controls around, keeping that data safe and the students safe. So, given that, what sort of legal and regulatory considerations are we seeing coming into the school space, given that they have this very, very disparate set of users of their data and they have to behave differently to a normal organisation?
Well, I think that's a particular challenge for schools. So we've seen a lot of change in Australia in the last couple of years in the sort of cyber-related regulatory framework. And most recently, it's been the successful passing of the cybersecurity bill through both houses, and it was actually put through a Senate, I think, just recently, as well as the amendments to the Privacy Act that introduce sort of obligations around child protection. So I think the feedback that we've had from school boards and from school IT directors and business managers has been that it's not sufficient in their view to just take an operational approach to cybersecurity. It is very much leaning into, all right, where are we at right now? What is the implications of the changes that have happened in legislation that may affect us as really quite large organisations? Some of the schools that we work with, many hundreds of faculty, many thousands of students, and actually very large revenues that need to be considered. Which brings them into, unfortunately, they're subject to all of the Australian privacy laws and the APPs, the Australian privacy principles. So most of the conversation we've had recently has been around, well, how do we demonstrate sufficient duty of care around cybersecurity to be able to anticipate the response we're going to have to make in the event of a cyber breach, and being able to talk to the regulators and things like mandatory ransomware disclosure, which has just been passed just recently. It is more of a business conversation than a cyber conversation. Yeah,
and I think that's a very important point. I think you touched on it earlier on there, where you were talking about IT business managers and the board. Cyber traditionally has been seen as, well, that's an IT-focused problem, right? Yep. Which is very, very challenging because these are now very much business and leadership and governance type scenarios and questions. So, one of the questions we get asked, and it'd be great to get your opinion on this, is, how can the school leadership drive better cybersecurity practices given the fact that this is no longer solely an IT thing?
That's interesting, and you're quite right. Like, the conversation is definitely well beyond just IT, but it's still underpinned by IT. The things that IT does are foundational to everything that we do with cyber. But the conversation is often a leadership and board level conversation coming down, which is fantastic on one hand because it definitely elevates the role of the IT director and the business manager to the board. But with great power comes great responsibility. And so, sort of to your question, like what can we be looking at in terms of educating staff and things like that? The challenge that I've heard talking to IT business managers, IT leaders and business managers, has been that the burden on teachers outside of just core teaching activities is pretty heavy. And so when we talk to them about fostering a culture of cybersecurity inside the organisation, the initial pushback is, oh, it's another thing that we're going to need to do. We're going to add another piece of work to a teacher's load. And the nice thing about that is, at least from a faculty perspective, bringing up the level of cybersecurity awareness training for individuals is best suited by bite-sized, frequent engagements with the cohort. So there's this concept of the, I hope I get this right, the Ebbinghaus forgetfulness curve. So it's some research was done actually in academia and it's related to how do adults learn. How do they best learn? And so anything that you've learned, you retain for a short period of time, and then that begins to atrophy. But if you frequently refresh that, what will happen is over time, yes, it continues to atrophy, but you get a net positive trend over time. And so taking that approach to cybersecurity awareness training or kind of cultural improvement in the school is a great way to do it without overburdening the teachers. Small, frequent, and ideally entertaining, because nobody has time.
No one has time for dull training. That's absolutely sure. And as educators, they think they see that in the classroom when the children aren't engaged. So and that brings in, I think, probably drive towards the point that going back to the nature of schools, the nature of learning, it is a very much an open environment. Children learn best when there is the example for them to grow. They can experience and push boundaries, and they can start learning and forming themselves. When we look at cybersecurity from a commercial and a corporate enterprise thing, is typically to lock everything down. I want to control everything. I want to take ownership of one of this. I want to cover this, potential attack vector. I want to do these sorts of things to make myself safe. With schools, they have a very different challenge. The decisions around pretty much everything are secondary to learning. So it's really interesting to get your views on, how are schools using the technology and the things available to enhance their cybersecurity, so that it doesn't impact or hinder the learning of the students.
Yeah, I understand. And actually that's a really good point. Like, the advantage that an enterprise has is they can be very restrictive and very militant on the controls that they place. And they can have an expectation that the audience that they're serving is an adult audience with a certain base level of skill. And in the schools, you can't do that, right? In the schools, you do have that cohort, that's the educators and the faculty of the school, but then you have the learners and the students. Who in some cases can be even more sophisticated than an enterprise IT person as you get to the upper grades of school. But then you have to have systems that cater for the the kindy through grade 4, and you can't do necessarily MFA and give them the same kinds of controls. So what we find in working with schools is there's two distinct paths, and it's dictated a little bit unfortunately by the IT architecture that's being deployed. How separate or integrated is the school in terms of being able to isolate the students from the faculty. And there's a real mix out there. I was quite surprised when we started working with schools that there's more integration or touch points between student networks and faculty networks than I would have expected. Mm-hmm. Now, in the most robust schools, there is a nice, strong separation. And I'll give you a great example. Very rarely do I see schools separating staff and student tenancies for Office 365. Mm-hmm. It tends to be one blended school tenancy. For some schools, I see them extend that tenancy to include parent accounts as well. So the more separation that you can implement in your approach to IT infrastructure, the better it is for the security operators to be able to apply a stricter set of controls in the areas that matter without hindering maybe the less secure networks or the sorts of networks that have staff on it or students on it that don't need that level of security operation. Yeah. So IT decisions made a long time ago drive kind of what we can do today.
Yeah, I mean, the technical debt that has to be overcome is always challenging, and I think you raised an interesting one there around, the age-old challenge of how you grant parental permission to see access into systems, because that's obviously a key part of learning. The systems are built for typical sort of enterprise engagements where they have no concept of a parent in that sense of structure, and digital identity is becoming very much one of the forefronts of cybersecurity threats. So as organizations, perhaps instead of challenging that technical debt and looking at that holistically with a long-term view, are actually creating the new frontiers of where they face their cyber threats. And given the fact that schools are housing so much secure information and sensitive information, what type of steps should a school take to start safeguarding that? You've already called out that there are regulatory compliance requirements, notification of breach and so on. What sort of steps should a school be doing to keep that data safe, and what have you seen out that's been delivered in the market? Yeah,
for sure. You actually you raised a really interesting point just in the final comments of that last section where you said identity is the new digital frontier, for protection. For all of the cases that we see at Arctic Wolf, that come into our security operations center that we issue tickets to customers for, 30% of them are sourced from an identity log source as the initial cause. So not coming from the endpoint tools, not coming from the firewalls, not coming from the network. Identity absolutely is sort of the key protect surface that we see. So we can sort of start there and go, the fusion of identity and data. So to answer the question specifically, where do we start with the data problem? And this has been a hot topic in all of the education conferences that we've been to over the last 12 months. How do you start tackling the challenges around data? Now, the good news is the government's doing some work in this space. So the challenge being in Australia is there are a lot of different regulatory frameworks related to data retention that apply to different organisations. And schools, unfortunately, have I would say probably one of the most complex data retention regulatory set of constraints. Lots of different sorts of data with lots of different sorts of retention periods and how that data must be handled and secured and treated. Some of which must be sovereign, some of which can go to trusted third-party countries, but all of it needs to be, unfortunately, number one, identified. And this is the biggest challenge that I've seen talking to, typically it's the business managers and the IT directors in the schools, where there's this big data governance project that needs to happen. We need to identify the data that we have. We need to identify the controls that are around that data. And there's an interesting low-hanging fruit that schools can adopt quite quickly. Most of them have reasonably good controls around most of the data. The bit that's missing often is an effective and quick response when when a policy is violated. Mm-hmm. So like when an access control policy is violated, or when there's behaviour in the environment that indicates that somebody's accessing data that they shouldn't. Because the tooling's already there, there is an operational component that can go on top of that to make kind of deliver value on top of the stuff they've already invested in. They've already done they've done 90% of the work. We just need to take it 10% further. Mm-hmm. And that can be in conjunction with a data governance, data assessment project. Yep. Often I'll see people want to stop and do an assessment of some sort. Let's do an Essential 8 assessment. Let's do a data governance assessment. Let's go and get an external penetration test and see what we look like from an external attacker's perspective before they go and do something else, which is good. But in the time that it takes you to do that, there's a window of opportunity. You could have actually implemented controls to improve your security posture, mm-hmm. To use the things you've already got to get a great outcome. And that's what we push really hard at ArcticWolf, is to use the things you've got, configured the way you've got them configured, to within an inch of their lives, then improve the configuration of those things you've already got, and then decide what you need to get that you don't already have. Yeah. But do it all from an operational perspective. Yeah, and I think that's sound advice. And I think going back to the data classification and data labeling thing is, you mentioned there, looking and doing that as a project. And I always see things like this as the IT landscape is always transforming. It never stands still. If you stand still, you get left behind. And what we're seeing with data classification and data labeling is, there's now an inflection point for most organizations out there when it comes to looking at things like AI, for example. And that is now driving a phenomenal opportunity to engage with schools around data labeling, data classification, how we're going to secure your data, because we have another actor in there looking at the data, AI-based systems. So what I would say to any school out there, when you're looking at that, always keep an eye on the cybersecurity angle, because we can use those inflection points to actually leverage better outcomes and get out of some of that tech debt that we currently find ourselves in. So, well, we've talked a lot of good stuff around all those sorts of things, and I think it'd be great to give, like I always like these things, a few examples of things done well, and also maybe a couple of where it's not done quite so well, or because they always get everyone's attention, and they're the ones that stick in everyone's mind. So if you could give us a couple of real life scenarios, perhaps naming and shaming would be, we've seen good and bad things, I think would be great for the viewers watching. Well, it's interesting. I think so there's many examples in Australia, unfortunately, of when things have gone bad, because it is made public. There's a couple of schools down here in Victoria that have recently been in the news, as well as in New South Wales and Queensland. So I think the bit that's most interesting to me about that is in closed forums, those schools are sharing with each other the lessons learned from kind of being subject to, for example, a successful attack, data exfiltration, and a ransomware event. So I don't need to belabor the points on that, because the audience, you guys can go take a look at this. You can see it on the web and look at those stories. It's interesting that the positive stories, we get them every week at ArcticWolf. So whilst I talk a lot about security operations and using the tools that you've already got, so for 24/7, if something happens, you can intervene. Most of the value that customers get working with Arctic Wolf is on the week-to-week proactive side. So how are we going out and finding good examples where a control maybe isn't implemented exactly like it should be, or like a great example just recently in a school up in New South Wales was one of our concierge engineers ran essentially a data analysis activity on all of the endpoints in the school, looking for things that indicated that people were storing passwords in files. And the IT director was pretty confident that nothing would be found. They'd been through this process, they'd implemented a password vaulting software, like all of the good things that you should have done. So excellent, you've got the system in place. People will be using our password vault software, which was also, just as an aside, was also licensed for home use. So that's a really interesting lesson. Like, yes, in their they were able to get the vendor to provide that software, but then also get a +1 for the users to use it at home. Brilliant. It's a fantastic idea. But sure enough, we went through that assessment, and a litany of examples of spreadsheets with passwords and usernames and all of that stuff was found on the network. Now, that's not a security operations activity. That's actually a security hygiene activity. But that's an example of something we do just as run-of-the-mill. We'll go and do that activity for customers.
Yeah, I mean, and it's always great because you always get those examples, and I love hearing about when the opportunity to take cyber comes to home, because we're seeing much more in the school space that, students have a device that's been given to by the school. There is perhaps an extension of duty of care to home as well. So it's great when we see that, moving out of, the on-premise and back to home, because, the identity goes anywhere, the data goes anywhere. So it's great to hear that, that sort of thing's happening. And it's one of the key topics for schools is the protection just doesn't stop, from 9 till 4 o'clock. It's potentially 24/7 as well for students. So, where can schools go for guidance and support in all of these types of scenarios? Because we've talked about lean IT teams, we've talked about, IT business managers, the board. There's a whole lot there, and this is an ever-changing landscape, and the guidance constantly changes. So I guess it's more of a conversational piece. But how do you see that conversation going, and where should schools turn to?
I think the most important thing for schools is to have an external counsel to lean on, like a trusted provider of some sort. Now, that could be Compnow and yourselves. It could be Arctic Wolf. Talking inside the community is also really helpful. Kudos to the Australian government. The work that the Australian Cybersecurity Centre has done promoting the Essential 8, fantastic. Like, it's getting very broad community adoption. Most of the schools that we work with are looking at the Essential 8 or on a journey to one maturity level or another. So that's brilliant. They have a framework that they didn't have before. Some very advanced schools are looking at more international frameworks, whether it be NIST or ISO 27000. Really, for schools, I think that's overkill in most cases. So pick a framework that gives you a path, and then have a provider that you can talk to about that, because you can't be an expert in all things, especially in cybersecurity. The pace at which things are changing, and it's not just technical change. It's not just threat actors doing different things or novel attacks and different tactics. The underlying environment itself in Australia is changing week on week, quarter on quarter. And so having that conversation, as you say, around, well, what does this mean to me as a school with the changes in legislation? This is not something that is changing once every 2 years or 4 years. This is changing every 6 months and even every quarter.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree around things like Essential 8. Even though they're focused in certain technology silos and certain aspects of that, they give a great learning and platform for organisations to become better at the governance around everything that's required that cybersecurity is. And kudos, to the Australian government for doing that sort of framework. And when organisations mature enough and they do want to look at something broader, suppose like a NIST or an ISO, they have the fundamental learnings and underpinnings that those more simple, more focused frameworks have given them. So even though it's not, people go, it's not really relevant to me, I always say, well, just pick a framework that you can build inside your organization. The experience and the learnings you'll get from that really set you up well for where this takes us, because as I said, this is ever changing. That framework, whichever one you pick, is always going to be updating itself, and start with something simple, easy, that you can be effective build confidence, build the governance of your organization around it is absolutely phenomenal as you learn how to do these things more effectively. But coming back to learning, and I think we touched on it very, very early on, where you said something along the lines, and certain students, when they get a little bit towards year 11 and 12, perhaps are sometimes more advanced than the organization they're inside when it comes to things like technology and especially cybersecurity. I've always been fascinated with that angle, because typically lots of those individuals will go on to be the cybersecurity experts of tomorrow, or at least in IT as a future career. How can schools make this a learning opportunity? If you get children engaged in this is where the transformation happens. So how are you seeing that entire cybersecurity as a learning opportunity thing going, Steve?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and it's a good point in that it is by the way, cybersecurity is a fantastic career path, and so I highly recommend that you encourage your students to take a look at it. Feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to come in and have a chat. Probably the best way that we've seen schools engage with the students on learning related to cyber. So number one, they do learn through the cyber hygiene activities. So rolling out the security awareness training, which is appropriate for a certain cohort of students, is useful. So definitely look at that. I find actually inside Arctic Wolf, our security operations team, we participate in a lot of the capture the flags, the CTFs that are out there, and we see a lot of schools competing in those CTFs as well. So when you have a kind of a cohort of interested folk in the student population, encouraging them to get involved in come to the B-Sides conference, go to the various conferences that permit students to come. And I'd almost say, without putting my team on the spot, make sure that the vendors that you're working with want to come in and spend time with you and talk about this in the context of the students. So, we'd be more than happy to come in and do that at Arctic Wolf, and we have done with the schools that we work with.
Brilliant. So I'm sure there'll be lots of schools looking to take up that opportunity and offer, because it takes us to what the future of this looks like. With the children learning, getting more advanced in this. Given that this is, as we said, a few times now, this is a changing environment. It never stands still. What do you believe the future looks like for cybersecurity in the independent schools? What new challenges are coming down the line, and how do you see organizations rising to meet those challenges?
Oh, that's such a pointed question. There's a couple of areas that I think are key that I definitely see schools moving towards. You touched on it before when you were talking about sort of selecting a framework and building some organizational muscle memory in using a framework, because then you can uplift. What I see with schools that we've worked with over the last couple of years is this definite shift to essentially a more continuous approach to cyber governance, to implementing of cybersecurity controls, to educating of staff related to cybersecurity. It's becoming sort of integral to the DNA of the school that this is not a one and done thing. And I think you alluded to a little bit with what the impact that AI will have on things like data labeling, data classification, to stop it being a one and done audit activity and kind of embed this culture of continuous improvement in data classification or data management or in cybersecurity on our side. So the future of cybersecurity in schools, I hate to say it, it's not going to get any easier, unfortunately. Threat actors know that their schools they're a very attractive target. They are getting stronger as well. I do see in Australia the culture over the last couple of years, especially in the independent schools around Australia, far more cyber aware. Having very effective board level conversations around understanding risk, and it isn't the theatre of cyber, as I like to call it. It is really pragmatic discussions around, what do we have, how do we protect it, what are the risks that we're exposed to, what is happening in the external environment that is going to change the way we need to look at what we're doing today, and what investment is needed, if anything else, from the school in letting IT and the business address those risks.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's sound advice. This is something that we've got to almost become systemic in everything we do, is always goes through the lens of we have to achieve this outcome, be it learning, be it business side of the education, and I always have to go through the lens of what does this do for my governance, what does it do to my cybersecurity posture, how do I react to that, how do I look at the tools and the skills I have, do I need to retool, do I need to upskill, do I need to bring something new in? And I think if we get into that mindset of every single transformation everything we do will change our own posture, plus the new external threats that are found every day. You're absolutely right. I love the phrase muscle memory. Getting into that habit, I think, is absolutely the right thing to do.
And if I can add one thing here as well, we've talked about this, before as we started to work together again. Having this concept of a journey, we call it the security journey at Arctic Wolf because we're focused on security. But that concept of a journey, which is, it's not a point in time activity. You identify where you're at, you make a plan for how you're going to get there. You might take some detours along the way, but that's an effective approach for all sorts of sort of technology and business capabilities that are needed in schools.
Yep, no, absolutely sign it. And as we come down to wind down the webinar, Steve, thank you very much for the time. I found it very insightful. I hope it's been a good chat for you as well.
I've enjoyed it very much. Hopefully the folk that are watching found it entertaining. And look, great to work with you again.
No, likewise, Steve. So, for everyone watching, thank you for your time. Just to know that Compnow provides IT custom built for your needs. If you'd like to know more about what we spoke about today, please get in touch with your Compnow account manager or email us at info@compnow.com.au. Thank you very much.